want to talk more, Britt, about this, the politics of this and the message he's sending. Obviously, we're in a crisis time. We're actually in two crises with the pandemic that we've been dealing with for weeks and weeks, and now this, and the protests that are turned to riots and looting in several cities. You're looking at Denver and Washington on your screen now. In 1968, candidate Richard Nixon ran on a law and order platform. In office was Lyndon Johnson, who was dealing with the riots and looting and protests after the 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. This is a different time, a different place, but is the law and order pitch going to change the dynamics, do you think, of President Trump versus former Vice President Joe Biden?
What's that?
Well, he certainly was confronted with a choice, Brett, of whether to identify himself with the protesters. Now, he says the appropriate things about the protesters, that he is with the peaceful protesters, that he believes in their right to have their message heard, and he has spoken with some strength about the death of George Floyd and how it happened and what a terrible thing it was. But the burden of his message tonight was clearly a law and order message. And it remains obviously to be seen whether this is the message that will be helpful to him. You know, if this is quelled in this strange age in which we live, these events that happen that we think are going to last for months and months in the public consciousness have a tendency sometimes to fade. The news cycle has become accelerated to a degree we wouldn't have thought possible not too many years ago. So it remains to be seen how this will be viewed. It also remains to be seen how this pandemic will be viewed. You know, if we don't get a second wave and things die down, we may end up with a pretty humdrum election. I might add this, Brett, that nothing seems to move the polling very much between these two candidates, Biden and Trump. Nothing seems to. We keep thinking it's going to, that it's going to make a big change here and there, but Biden remains about 5 or 6 points ahead, as he has in the polling average has been for quite a long time.
Yeah, Britt, it's hard to put into words the evolution that we've seen for the country. I mean, we've been through a lot over the past few months with this pandemic, the reaction to it. Remember all of these protests in different states where people were saying they're not social distancing enough, they're not wearing enough masks. And now in the reaction to George Floyd and that heinous video, we're seeing these protests erupt, some of them starting peacefully and then evolving into these riots and looting. Hard to put it all in context, how monumental it is.
It's quite striking. It is, you know, we've been saying for several years now that covering the Trump years in Washington has been like trying to drink water out of a fire hose. Well, if that was true before, it is really true now. I mean, we are confronted with major news stories tumbling on top of one another in a way that I've rarely seen before. 1968 came pretty close. I remember living through that. That was, you know, they had the King assassination, then the Bobby Kennedy assassination, the riots that bedeviled the convention, particularly the Democratic convention in Chicago. This is on that same order, and maybe even greater when you introduce the element of this healthcare crisis we've been struggling through. So this is a time like none I think I can say I've ever seen in, what, 53 or 4 years as a journalist.
The Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, saying that this is an hour of great pain and unrest in our country. You're looking live at Denver on the left side of your screen from our affiliate there, a protest in downtown Denver, and on the right side, Fort Worth, Texas. Every state, Britt, and even in places around the world, have seen protests of some kind. Some states, obviously, the focus of some of this activity that the administration is saying is largely from outside groups, and they point to Antifa specifically. Others point to white supremacist groups being mixed into some of these cities as well. Either way, stirring the pot and causing a lot of chaos.
And worth remembering, Brett, that one of the things that was a hallmark of the civil rights movement and the demonstrations that accompanied it was that it won over a nation. It changed the heart of a nation. People came over to the side of the African American cause, the civil rights cause. They were won over to it, and that change in this country created a consensus in favor of against racism that is a powerful force to this very day. If you can't afford to be called or labeled successfully a racist in America and survive in public life, you can't survive in a corporation. So what we're seeing now is an interesting thing. We saw this hideous image of this man having his neck stepped on to his death. And I think America was united about that. But what we're seeing now is not uniting, it's dividing. And this is the contribution that those who have turned this into looting and rioting have made against, one would suppose, the cause that they might claim they're supporting. It's damaging to that cause.
The most striking thing today, Britt, was the family of George Floyd, Terrence Floyd, and the family members gathered in Minneapolis saying that they are fighting for peace, that they don't identify with these riots, the looting, the damage, that they are fighting for peace. And that is what his brother, Terrence Floyd's brother, George, would be fighting for as well. Last word here.
Pretty powerful stuff from him today, Brett. You're right about that, and one hopes that message will be heard. But we've got people involved in the radicals involved in this rioting who are probably not going to hear that message, and those are the ones that need to be suppressed, caught, arrested, dealt with. That's where we are.
Yeah. Well, let's pray for a safe night tonight. Britt, thank you as always. Washington, D.C. on your screen, Fort Worth, Texas, continuing coverage on Fox News Channel. That's it for this special report. Fair, balanced, and still unafraid.